our entire motivation, like what motivates us, what gets you to do ambitious things is this kind of selective reinforcement cycle. Motivation is actually really simple. So when you're approaching, let's say, a subject you're studying, and you have frustration, those are like punishments. Those are like the rat in the cage getting zapped. And then eventually they stop pressing the lever. And so I think for a lot of people, they give up on learning because you have frustration, and then you stop doing it. Whereas if you have small success, you get more motivated. It becomes more fun to do the thing that you're doing. And so a big part of architecting a successful learning project is trying to design it in a way that...
Hey legend, in this episode we are talking to Scott Young, who wrote Ultralearning. This guy is an ultra learner. He's well known for not just his best-selling books and being in the New York Times and being a really prominent blogger about learning, but he also took these incredible challenges, which we talk about a lot in the episode, which is firstly the MIT challenge, where he took MIT's 4-year undergraduate computer science degree in 12 months without going to any actual classes. He took a lot of flack from MIT students while he was doing it, but he nailed it, which is absolutely mind-blowing. I couldn't even do it in 6 years, let alone one. And then he also did a year without English, where he went to Spain to speak Spanish. He went to Brazil, spoke Portuguese. In China, he spoke Mandarin. And in Korea, he spoke Korean, obviously. So this guy is absolutely nailing the art of learning and has a lot of knowledge to share with us, as well as some really cool stories. So it was a lot of fun. It's not just about learning how to learn. Like, he shared a lot of experiences and along this fun journey that he's had. So I hope you enjoy this episode. You can get a lot out of it. I personally love learning through stories, so it was a lot of fun. Take care. Scott, thanks for coming on. I'm really excited to get this opportunity to talk to you and dive deep on some really good stories and exciting things you've done in your journey. I'd love to know just a really quickly, what are you up to right now and what are you well known for?
Wow. Yeah. Well, we were just talking before we hit record here about how I just submitted the manuscript for my next book that's coming, which is also going to be about learning. We'll probably touch on that a little bit later.
Great title, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you. Get better at anything. So it's kind of the spiritual sequel to Ultralearning. And I mean, the thing that I'm known for, I guess, is I write about learning a lot, which has sort of been the obsessive focus of my essay career over the last 15 years. But if I have to pick what's my claim to fame, usually people are like, oh yeah, you're that MIT challenge guy. That's the thing, if you kind of vaguely heard about me, is the thing I'm probably most well known for, which was, starting when in my kind of early 20s, I did these learning challenges, which were these big year-long efforts on my blog where I was documenting. So one of them, the MIT challenge, was trying to learn MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum using just their free online resources over 1 year. And then I had another project with a friend where we went and traveled around and we're trying to learn 4 languages in 1 year. And so the kind of gimmick, I guess, of that project was that we weren't going to speak in English. So when we landed the country, we land in Spain, we're only going to speak in Spanish, and we have 15 hours of practice. So our Spanish is really bad. And it was amusing and fun, but it actually really worked. We were able to have conversations and speak in it was Spanish, Brazilian Portuguese, Mandarin Chinese, and Korean were the languages we were learning. And we have videos and so you can judge for yourself. I don't want to make any overly exaggerated claims. I think sometimes the language learning is one of these fussy things where if you say, oh, I'm totally fluent in this after 2 months, and then there's the guy who studied it for 10 years is like, do you know the word for pterodactyl or something like that? But in terms of I think what most people want when they're trying to learn a language is oh, I could go to this place and just be functional. I could go to stores and ask for things. I could make friends, and it was totally at that level. So we can talk about that too. And I've also done other things. I have a project learning quantum mechanics. I have a project learning portrait drawing. I have a project learning my wife's language. She's from North Macedonia, and so after my son was born in the peak of the pandemic, we did a little no English experiment at home for that too. So this has been kind of my claim to fame, I guess you could say, is taking on unusual self-directed learning projects. And that's sort of the topic of my book, Ultralearning, which is about people who take on unusual self-directed learning projects and sort of trying to extract wisdom from their experiences.
Love it. And what are you really looking forward to in the coming 12 months?
Well, I mean, I'm looking forward to my next book coming out because, as I said, that's been we were talking in the shows, that's been a long process of writing that book. I'm looking forward to doing a little bit of travel. I have 2 young kids, as we were also talking about, and we haven't done as much travel between pandemic and 2 small babies, but I'm looking forward to maybe doing a little bit of traveling and maybe even dust off one of the languages that I've learned. And just I'm always enjoying learning new things. So I never really know which thing I'm going to try to take on next, but I'm always trying to learn new things. And so I'm sure in the next 12 months there's going to be something that catches my fancy and starts a little, maybe slightly too obsessive project to learn. Yeah.
Where did that originate? Was the MIT challenge the first one you did, or did you start this when you were younger and you were okay,
I mean,
projecting?
it was the first public project, and I think this is something that's important to bring up, that it's very much like the thing that was motivating this was not just, oh, well, I just want to do this intense thing in a vacuum, but also I had been blogging, writing on a platform for 5 years, and I've been writing about learning. I've been in school, I've been writing about studying tips, and the thing that really caught my eye was around that time, you had people like Josh Kaufman's Personal MBA, Benny Lewis had Fluent in 3 months, even people like Steve Pavlina had a big thing where he talked about his experience learning computer science and math double major over 3 semesters. And I just thought, this is really cool. Is it not just, oh, I'm going to just give you advice because I'm just some random guy on the internet, but I'm going to do it and talk about doing it. And I thought that was something that the blogging medium was particularly suited for. So I've always been interested in learning. I've always been, the kinds of projects that undergirded these things were also things I was interested in when I was younger. When I was 15, I was trying to learn video game development. And so I remember trying to to varying degrees of effectiveness, learning programming and art and these kinds of things. So I don't want to say that, this just came out of nowhere, but this was the first public project I did. It was very much modeled on okay, you set an ambitious target or you set some ambitious kind of idea for the project, and then you talk about it while you're doing it. And so that was the first big one I did. And it went really well. So I did another one, which was language learning, which was also kind of evolved out of, I had a friend who was going to take a gap year and he wanted to travel. And we were good friends. We were roommates. And I was like, well, what if we do something like this? And so we did that. But, so it was really also just an excuse to do a world trip. It wasn't really, oh, yes, I want to study these 4 languages. That's what I'm going to do. It was just kind of where could we go that would be fun? And, it would be a good experience. And then, since the MIT challenge, since those projects, they kind of put me on the map a little bit of maybe not just some random college student has a study advice blog. That has been a big part of what I've done. So as I mentioned, some of the other smaller projects I've done. And I mean, now I'm a bit older. I have 2 kids. So doing the throw your entire life on the side and do some obsessive pursuit is a little harder now. But I mean, the spirit of it is still there. It's always been there. So, right now I'm working on improving my watercolor painting. I don't know whether I'll post something about that later. It's very much just for me, but that's one thing I'm doing. And, I'm sure there's going to be other things. I've also gotten a lot more into reading research. That wasn't something that I did before, but now when I'm what is the best way to learn a language? So you get 3 textbooks and you're I want to know everything that any smart person has ever said on this so I can, talk about it intelligently. So that's also been something I've more recently gravitated towards.
Cool. What did you find hardest about doing the MIT challenge? Because you provide a bit of context, coming from somewhere like Australia. MIT was something I'd heard maybe in a movie. You know what I mean? I'm so there's no context about how difficult it was.
Yeah. So MIT is Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's one of probably the best STEM schools in the entire world. It is extraordinarily hard to get into. I think especially when you compare it to other Ivy League schools like Harvard or something like that. I don't believe MIT does legacy admits. And so it's the more meritocratic maybe of the schools. It has more of a reputation for even if you're smart, you can get bad grades. Whereas, Harvard tends to be a little bit softer on that. And so I don't know. I'm not actually an MIT student, so this is just my cultural impression and just from, the little pitter patter you hear in the online lectures. But the way that this project came about was I had done a business degree in school, somewhat foolhardily thinking, oh, I want to be an entrepreneur. I should study business. Turns out, no, that's not always the best idea because business school is mostly training you to be a middle manager in a big corporation. And I only learned that kind of halfway through, oh, oh, this is mostly HR classes and stuff. I was thinking this is like how to run a company. It's like, okay, here's how to set up, standard operating procedures for this. So I was a little disappointed, I guess, maybe after my undergraduate education. And I was thinking, oh, I should have learned computer science because then I could actually do something. Like I wouldn't just be like one of those talking head business guys. I'd actually be able to make the thing that I wanted to do. And it was something I'd always wanted to learn. I'd been kind of tossing and turning between the two of them when I was going into school. But I mean, I've already got a degree, going back to school for another 4 years. And then, like you're a mature student, you're kind of like, I don't want to live in a dorm anymore and do all this kind of stuff. So I had a real ambivalence about it. I wanted to learn it, but I wasn't that keen on the degree process. And it was around that time that I found out that MIT, this kind of like, this school just puts their courses online. Like you can just take them. Like they just have, they set up a camera in the class and they just recorded the guy talking and they're like, here's all the problem sets in the exams the kids did. And like, this is what we were using. And I mean, it varies. Some of the classes are like, this is a PowerPoint slides with no lecture. So I don't want to make like, I don't want to exaggerate here, but a lot of them are like that, especially the early classes, like, the physics class by Walter Lewin. I mean, this is one of the best presented classes I've ever seen in my entire life. Like this is way better than classes I paid money for to go to in school. And so I think maybe I took, it was like an algorithms class, I just watched it randomly. And I was like, man, this is really good. Like why would you need to go to school? You could just watch these things. And, again, stepping background, this is, early blogging days, peak Tim Ferriss. This is, and I'm talking about some of my influences, like Josh Kaufman had his personal MBA, which was like a little different. He was more like, making a book list of like, this is what you'd have to learn if you're doing an MBA program. And Benny Lewis was doing his Fluent in 3 months projects. We can talk about that when it comes to language learning, but he was a huge influence for me, not just in terms of language learning methodology, but like he's out there doing it. He's like, I'm going to learn, Thai in 3 months. And then there's like, here's video from like week 1 or something. I was like, this is super cool. So I thought, well, I'm already a blogger. At that point, my study skills kind of blog was doing okay. I was able to make enough money that I wasn't like, I need a job right away. And I was thinking, what, this would be the perfect time to do it. I've got some time. I've just recently graduated. I'm not like deep in some other thing. I've got some money because I'm making a bit of money from the blog. So I'm not like hard up for finances.
Okay,
if
sweet.
I'm going to
So
do some big year-long project.
Side part of income. That was your side income.
Yeah. Well, I had been writing my blog since high school, so I was making some money just from these like little study skills kind of courses. And obviously, if you write, you're making courses about study skills. Like this is a very relevant kind of thing of like, okay, I want to apply it on something. And taking the courses, like I'd always been a decent student, and it was something that I thought, well, you know what, if I like pulled out all the stops, like really like, went 100% into the productivity and working hard and doing it, maybe I could do it in a compressed time frame. And this is also some of the like arrogance of being 24, but you're like, yeah, I'm going to try to do this in a year, and I'm going to like declare it publicly that I'm going to do it before I start, which even now I'm not quite sure why I decided that was like going to be what I did, but that's what I did. And so I did do it. It was a lot of work, and I got lucky in some places. Like, as I said, I've talked about here that, I really, really worked hard like the first 3 or 4 months, but it was kind of like the classes were getting easier as I was getting more burned out. So I was able to like hit the deadline. It could have been the case that the classes were getting harder, in which case I just would have failed. But so there was a little bit of luck there, a little bit of me being overly optimistic, but somehow pulling it off. But I mean, it was a lot of studying. I was, probably studying about, 8 to 10 hours a day, maybe even up to 12 hours in the beginning, and then more like 8 hours near to the end of the project. But it was full time. Like I was Monday to Friday. I was doing this every day. And it was exciting too because, I mean, first of all, I wasn't paying any tuition, so it wasn't like you didn't have to do that. That's insane.
That's insane that you did that. That's like, you just...
Well, I know the MIT Challenge one is the least approachable of all the projects. Like when I talk to other people about it, they're like, well, I'm not going to do that, or I can't do that. And I'm like, I know you're not. Like it was a kind of like, even I can't do it right now. I've got 2 kids at home. There's no way I'm doing it. But I think like if you want to just step back and extract the lesson from it, the idea that you can learn from the best school in the world, the kind of a quite job ready skill, which is programming computer science. This is not just like art history or something that's just for your edification. Like you can get jobs with this. The fact that you can learn these skills just free online is just incredible. And I think it's something that is not taken advantage enough by most people. But anyways, that was the project there.
How did you manage yourself through that process? Because I mean, 24
Yeah.
is a really different age. I think myself 24 to now at 30, it's like two different people. Like, I'm like, how did you?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think part of it was, in some ways, I think it was maybe easier to do it then than it would be now. And as I mentioned, like not having any responsibilities. My business at that point was like I'd been used to running it on top of studying, so I hadn't like added all this extra complexity that maybe like I have a team now and this kind of thing, and so it's a lot harder to just like compress things down. So I think in some ways it was easier. And I think also, sort of some background to it. Since I had been about 15, I had been interested in entrepreneurship. And so this idea of like doing, like kind of working really hard on a sort of self-directed project was something I'd already been doing for almost 10 years. That like I had been, I want to start a business. So like, okay, I'm going to be like, when I started writing my blog, I was like, okay, I'm going to write an essay. Like I think there was one period where also doing some freelance articles to make a little bit of money through college. It's like writing like 10 articles a week or something on top of the study. So this was something that I was already used to, like managing my time, being productive, got to get stuff done. So I was already used to that. And I think, again, I think when I talk about studying too, I think the thing that's harder to convey about this project was that like I actually really enjoyed it. Like I enjoyed the classes. I thought they were really interesting. They were well taught. I liked the subject. There were some that were like, okay, this is hard. Like I'm struggling here, but most of them were not. I'm so underprepared for this that it's like stressing me out. And so I think that is also important too to keep in mind. Like I had the necessary prerequisite background. I'd even done a few programming courses in college, so I don't want to say that I had zero computer science experience, although the thing that's also misleading is that most people think computer science is just programming, but actually it's mostly math. So I hadn't done as much as it would be useful as you might think as to an outsider, but I came into it not totally unprepared. And so I think that also made it more enjoyable than super stressful. Like if I was just like, well, I don't even know algebra and I'm starting like MIT's calculus course, is going to be like, nah, I can't do this. So I think it was well timed and well chosen, the particular project. And I enjoyed it, and it was something that I could just dive deep in and obsess over. And I think there's something, I don't know, I didn't get this when I was in my actual schooling, but there's something really exciting about working on a project that is challenging, that's interesting, that's something that like you're personally motivated to pursue, that's different from like, well, I guess I got to take this class to, get my credits to graduate or something, So I think that was a big part of it as well.
Wow. And what did you do when you finished? Like, was it just a day and it was over? Or like,
yeah, pretty much. Well, it is a little anticlimactic because I mean, there's no ceremony.
Yeah, you're not at school. You're just by yourself.
Yeah,
like,
I think I got dinner with a friend, and we had like my roommate at the time. I was like, all right, let's just that's how I can celebrate. But I think, to me, the kind of like, if there is some sort of like culmination of it, was that I'd been posting about this project like as it was happening for a year, and it wasn't getting tons of attention. It wasn't like, oh, I'm famous right off the bat. Like when I made the announcement, I got a lot of hate mail from MIT students. Like they really didn't like that I was going to do this project. And it kind of surprised me. That's like the most hate mail I've ever gotten in my entire career. I tend not to ruffle too many feathers, but I was got like angry emails from MIT students, just kind of like, how dare you? Who do you think you are? Kind of thing. So, but when I started doing it, that kind of quieted down. And so I've been posting about this for a year. I'd been like, oh, I had this like little like vlog kind of thing on YouTube, which I made the stupid decision of putting it on a different YouTube channel than my main one, and you can't merge them after. But if you go there, you can find like my pimply face from like 24 being like, well, I did this class this week, and here's my studying tips for the day, and that kind of thing. And so I'd been doing this for a year, like, and no big thing, but I was like, you know what, I enjoy it. This is good, and it'll be good for me to like, you reference this when I'm talking about like effective studying strategies and stuff in the future, and blah blah blah. And then when I made the final video, I just said, I did it. Like I finished all the courses that I said I was going to do, kind of anticlimactically. And that video got like the front page of Reddit, and it kind of blew up like that.
Yeah.
Kind of made me a little internet famous. And then I wrote a guest post about the project on Cal Newport. He has a blog, a good friend of mine. And I wrote about it. And that got picked up in China and became like super popular. And I was getting like, Chinese publishers contacting me, like, because I wrote this ebook in college, and they're like, "We want to publish your book," like this kind of thing. And I was like, "Oh, okay." So it was a kind of a funny experience, because I had really been doing this sort of like, well, that was fun, but like, whatever. And then all of a sudden you're getting comments from people, and it was really interesting to see the discussion of it, because there were the people being like, this is great. And then there's other people being like, well, it's too bad that all that matters is the degree, and that you're never going to get a real job. And then there's like an HR manager replying to that person being like, I'd hire him. And I remember even a guy from Microsoft reached out to me and was like, are you looking for a job? And I was kind of like, no, not really, but thank you. So.
That's the best.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Like, did it give you a lot of confidence? Like when you finished it?
I mean, right after I finished, there was I think there's anytime you set a goal for yourself that's challenging and then you achieve it, you just have this, like, you're just sort of mental model yourself gets updated. And so for me, like, although I had been learning things and doing stuff, I'd never done anything this sort of explicit and large in scope. But after doing it, I was like, oh yeah, like you could do this for anything, like anything you want to learn, you could just do this. So I think that's a belief that I have, that I sometimes forget that most people have, that like, oh, if you just wanted to like learn everything you wanted to learn, like you could just do that, like in economics or like any kind of academic subject. It's like, yeah, you could just do that. There's nothing stopping you. Like you have to invest the time, but there's no like, oh, there's some secret barrier that prevents you from doing it. And then that was kind of that confidence of, and also just like the positive feedback you get from other people about it was a major ingredient in, like, a year later we did that Year Without English project. So I think I definitely wouldn't have considered the Year Without English if I had not been riding high from finishing the MIT challenge, but they were both of that vein. Yeah.
Amazing. And what with the Year Without English, like that was your roommate, right? Was that a conversation where he was thinking about doing a gap year and you were like, we should do this instead, and then book the tickets next week? Or how did that come about?
I mean, it really started as a let's travel together, and then I just kept kind of like raising the stakes. So I think if I go back to the history of those conversations, he was interested in going to Korea, and so we had talked about going to Korea for maybe a month, as like a, oh, that'll be fun as a trip. And then I remember there was a while we were talking about doing a road trip throughout the United States. So like, I'm just telling you, like these things kind of come from weird directions. And then it was like, well, if you're going to take a year off, he had been working in an architecture firm. He had saved up some money. He was going to go do his master's, and he thought, I'd like to do this, while I'm already quitting my job. And so we were thinking, well, maybe we'll go do like a little kind of world trip. And I had done a year abroad when I was in university. I lived in France for a year, and I had learned French, but it was like grinding and kind of difficult. And then sort of right after the MIT challenge, I went and I had a little vacation for myself. I went and I lived in Paris for a month. And when I was there, I was like, I'm only going to speak in French. Now, I'd already learned French, so I'm not saying that this was like starting from scratch. But it was kind of like when I was there, I was like, this is what I should have done from the beginning, right? I should have done this because it works really well. Like once you're like, oh, I'm here and I'm only going to speak in French, the whole social world around you kind of adapts and changes. Whereas if you're like, well, I'm going to speak it whenever it's comfortable. No. You just form this like protective coat of English around yourself. And this sort of sociological phenomenon was like, well, what if you like you weren't even that good and you just like went there and you're like, I'm only going to speak in this language. Would it work? And I was inspired by Benny Lewis, who kind of has these public fluent in 3-month projects. But I've also seen, even like when I was living in France, there were people whose English wasn't as good, who were coming from countries where like there's not a lot of people who speak their language. Like they're from Czechoslovakia or Czech or Republic, or they're from somewhere else in Eastern Europe, and there's only like 1 or 2 other people from their country who are on exchange there, and their English wasn't great. And they maybe knew a little bit of French. They're like, I'm just going to speak in French because what else am I going to do? And their French was so good at the end of the period because, obviously, right, you're spending all your days speaking it nonstop. And so I had some inclination that this would work, but I didn't know that it was going to work. And so we thought, well, like, what if we make this as a kind of an experiment where we try not to speak English to the greatest extent possible, and just like to be clear for the year, this was not something that we upheld perfectly. But in Spain, we were very close to being perfect about it. The Asian countries, there was a little bit more slipping, but generally the idea was that like we should be speaking all the time. So if there's a slip or something, you have to like.
So if it's
back.
just the two, if it was just the two of you. You were still committing to trying to speak.
Oh yeah. Then that was the central thing. That was the central thing is that like we're in our apartment, being like with Google Translate, being like "voy a ducharme," like I'm gonna go take a shower or something. Like "tengo hambre," like that was what we were doing. So it wasn't just like, oh, when we go on the street and we meet strangers, we're gonna speak in Spanish. It was like, no, we're gonna like show up there and like be talking to each other with our dictionaries, and you can. We did audio recordings. We kind of got lazy with it near toward the end, but like in Spain, we have audio recordings like they were almost daily, like from the beginning. So you can go and you can listen to us. Like this is what our actual conversations were like in the beginning. It's a little painful, but I mean that was the idea, and we, I was very inspired by Benny Lewis, but I definitely wasn't being like, oh, this is going to be me fluent in these languages after 3 months, because I'm like, I don't know, this project might just bomb, like it might just get there, like this is impossible. Sorry guys, it doesn't work. We can't do it. And so I really didn't know what was going to happen when we got there. But in Spain, it actually worked pretty well. Like we were able to make friends, and we were, living our lives, going on dates, and like we were doing a level of involvement in the country that we weren't anticipating. So kind of like the MIT Challenge experience, just like having something that go like better than expected just gives you so much more confidence. We're like, oh yeah, this works. Like this is what you got to do. And so that we were riding high from that. I think that carried us even through like the difficult parts of China and Korea, which by the way are much harder.
I imagine.
Yeah.
Like what was the like curve like, was the first 2 weeks just, you're kind of like looking at each other like, what the hell are we doing? And then it picked up and it got
I mean, it's exhausting. Like the first couple of weeks are hard. And I think they're especially hard when you don't know when the light at the end of the tunnel is coming. And so I think that's when I've talked to people about this. I think it's not even so much like even you can go on like silent meditation retreats where you're not speaking at all for like 2 weeks. And people can do that. So in some ways you'd think, well, if I can only speak this other language and use Google Translate, that has to be easier than that, right? But I think what's hard about it is not just like the mental difficulty of like, okay, what is this word and how do you say this again and blah, blah, blah. It's also just, I don't know whether this is ever going to get better. I don't know whether we're going to get out of this. And so the beginning was like, you're not talking as much, you're having conversations, you're trying to just like, and you're dealing with daily life too. Like I got to get a SIM card and like, this kind of stuff. Where am I getting my groceries and this sort of thing? But I think we did manage to get to this. Like we did do a little bit of practice with Spanish before. I think we did about 50 hours, mostly Pimsleur. So we weren't like zero when we were starting. So we were able to communicate a little bit. And then when we were going to, I think we were lucky as well. Benny Lewis actually happened to be in Valencia, like right when we were going there as well, which is also kind of a weird coincidence. And so he was there and he speaks Spanish with us. So that was helpful. And he introduced us to some friends that he had. And we managed to meet, we went to this like random kind of Erasmus party early on. And Erasmus is, if you're not aware of what it is, it's a European exchange program. So people from different European countries frequently go on like a year abroad, but it's to another country in Europe. So there were lots of people who were in kind of a similar boat. Like they don't know anyone, they're making friends. And so it's a real easy socializing kind of like, okay, we've instantly got some friends who are like willing to humor our terrible Spanish. And so that helped as well. And so, after about a month, we were kind of like, oh, like we can get by. Like our Spanish isn't good, but it's not like strenuous anymore. And And then I think by the time we were like about 2.5 months in, we had this kind of feeling of like, yeah, we're good. Like we're not. That sounds really overconfident because I'm sure if you listen to recordings, it's like, oh, you were supposed to use the subjunctive here or this kind of thing. But just from the personal fluency point of view, just the fact that like the words come automatically, you don't have to stress over it. That was a level that we reached relatively quickly. Whereas I would say most people who take classroom language learning, you never get to that fluency level. Like a lot maybe, but you're not fluent in everything. So it's effortful even after 2-3 years of Spanish classes. Whereas if you're speaking all the time every day, you just don't even think about it. It's just like talking in English for the most part. Your vocabulary is more limited and you make more mistakes, but it's like that. So that was our experience with Spain and Spanish. And again, that just kind of carried us over. So when we were starting Portuguese, which we didn't do any practice for, which was definitely bumpy getting there, we had this kind of, well, we know it's going to get easier, and it did. And same with like Chinese and Korean were a lot harder, and they had a lot more frustrations. But it was the same basic like, well, we know this works. And so even like at the end of China, where you encounter a lot more daily frustrations because every single word is different, so you can't like just rely on like Coca-Cola's Coca-Cola kind of overlap in languages. There was that basic confidence of, okay, like we've done it enough times now that we know that if you just stick to it, you get through it.
Nice. What were the cultures like with accepting and helping you out and trying to get you like? Was it different?
Surprisingly good. I mean, that's the main worry people have, is that people are going to be really hostile to this. And one of the first phrases that we would learn in every country is that, like, I have a project to only speak this language. And the funny thing is how much that changed people's opinions of you. Because when you're speaking Spanish badly, first of all, Spanish people, I don't know, my general impression is that they're always very, at least in Spain, we're very willing to speak in Spanish to you, no matter your level of ability. Like some other countries I've traveled to, there's a little bit of snobbishness sometimes about like, no, but my English is better than your thing. So like, what?
Yeah, you're like, get on with it.
I don't like this, But Spain, it was kind of like, it didn't matter how garbage my Spanish was. People were kind of like, oh yeah, we can speak in Spanish. Like, I'm not going to speak in English, even though I'm fluent in it. And so so that like some of it may have been country choice, but I found that when you told people what you were doing, they were almost universally supportive. I find that like when you visit a country, most people's impression is that the typical tourist does not take any time to learn their language, to learn their culture, to learn, you know what I mean? And so being very forthright of like, oh, this is what we're doing. People are like, yeah, that's what you're doing. That's what most tourists should do. Like everyone here just speaks in English all the time. So they understand. And actually the only pushback that we got was occasionally from people who were not locals there. So I remember having this party. Then we're really like Spain. We're really being strict about not speaking English. I don't want to say I was this strict everywhere else, but there was this guy. I think it was like from Poland or so. He was like trying to talk to me, and he didn't speak Spanish very well. And I was like, voy a hablar en español, no voy a hablar en inglés. And he was kind of like, what are you doing? Like speaking English to me. Like he was getting mad at me because I was like just steadfastly refusing to talk to him. So I found that a little bit funny. But I mean, Spanish people generally were, as soon as you explained what the project was, they were like, yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, there was a similar experience in China and Korea. Korea was a little bit trickier because I found that the young people in Korea had much better English ability. So there was a lot more situations where it's sort of like, well, this is clearly more difficult than it needs to be because I'm speaking in Korean. And so there were more breakdown moments. It was also the end of the trip, so we were also exhausted. And China had the benefit of where we were in China, which was Kunming, China. There was no one who spoke English, so we didn't have to worry about that. Like we couldn't speak in English to these people if we wanted to. Like there was just sort of like, oh my God, this is a crisis, but there's nothing else I can do because there's no way this person understands what I'm saying. So there was something enjoyable about that. It was just like, well, this is still the best option, even how bad my Chinese is.
That's amazing. Yeah, and as far as, because I've always been really curious, like I've only got a bit of Spanish in my head and English. Mm-hmm. When you have that many languages in your head, you essentially end up a year with 5. Is there overlap? Do you get confused? Like how did it start to compound and,
I think interference. So this is the sort of psychological term for what you're talking about. Interference, which is where you have like kind of two competing memories. I think that's the biggest challenge of learning multiple languages. If you could just learn them all in isolation and then somehow you just like flip a switch in your brain and okay, now I'm speaking Spanish, only Spanish words, or now I'm speaking this, only this words. It would be much easier to learn like 10 to 20 languages. The hard part is that when you learn one, it's like competing with the other. And I really noticed that when we were in Spain. So again, like we're in Spain right now. A couple years prior, I'd learned French, and French to a decent level. Like I could have conversations in it. And I remember we were in Barcelona near the end of the trip, and we went to some kind of meetup thing, and there were some French people, and I was like, "Oh, I can speak to them in French," and it was like I can't speak French anymore. Like I literally couldn't. It was like, it was like this mental block, like because you're suppressing so hard saying the Spanish words. And if you practice both of them alternating, that does get easier. So I don't want to say that it's like a permanent issue, but it definitely compounds the difficulty because when you learn a new language, you tend to have to do practice of the old languages to kind of keep them separate, so to speak. So there was work after the trip, I think, of doing that. Ironically, it tends to be worst for the languages that you get the most benefit from. So when you're learning Spanish after French, you get a lot of benefit because there's similarities in grammar and vocabulary. Portuguese, you get a huge benefit because it's very similar to Spanish, but then you have to keeping them separate is very hard. Whereas Chinese, which was very difficult because you're building it up from scratch, basically, I never confuse it with other languages. So like if I'm speaking Chinese, I know I'll have no interference from like Macedonian or Spanish. There's never a chance that a Spanish word's going to pop out when I'm speaking Chinese. Sometimes there's Korean. I get a little bit of interference from Chinese, but my Chinese is a lot better than my Korean. But this is like kind of a trade-off, right? Like if you know Spanish and you learn Italian, you're going to learn Italian much faster than if you didn't know any. But then you're going to have a harder time speaking Spanish. So you have to like kind of pay that price after to like get them untangled. So yeah, that's definitely a challenge, I think, of learning multiple languages. But my basic feeling is that I think if you have the viewpoint of languages that like, well, it's something you're going to have to study for like 10 years in school to be able to do it at all, then it makes sense to be worried about that. But I think my attitude now is more like, well, if you're going to go somewhere for more than 2 weeks, like why not learn a bit of the language? Like it's it sounds really arrogant when I say it, but it's not that hard to get to that like basic level. So my wife and I, our last like major trip before we had kids, we went to Tokyo for like 10 days. So I was like, wow, why not do like 30 days of Pimsleur? And I definitely could not speak Japanese, but like it was enough that when we went to Mount Fuji and we were staying in one of those like traditional ryokan hotels, and I had to like ask them whether we could get breakfast, and then I found out we couldn't. The guy didn't speak English for some reason. The hotel reception guy couldn't speak English, and I was able to communicate with him and like ask him where things are and stuff. And like that's a level that is definitely not enough to make friends. So I don't want to like equate it to what we were doing. But if you're going to be somewhere for 10 days, it can be really helpful. And so I think that's something that like I've adopted as kind of a philosophy that like, oh, if I'm going to go to a place, you might as well learn at least a little bit. Like, why not? And I think some people are very reluctant to do that just because they've had that classroom experience where it's like, oh no, but if I start doing this, it's going to be 10 years,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's interesting. Like we were in Nicaragua for 9 months, and my girlfriend Bianca speaks Spanish. She grew up like his parents are Spanish, Colombian, and French, a little bit of Italian, and I was able to get away with a lot when we were together in Nicaragua, and then she went back to do her CPA exams back to Vancouver, and I was alone. I was by myself for 3 months. Yeah. It's like, it's so crazy how like when you go, when you mentioned getting the SIM card, it's like you go to get the SIM card and nobody speaks English and you just have to learn.
Yeah.
And it was really
interesting. Yeah, you got the Google Translate. You're like, quiero una tarjeta SIM. Like, you're doing that, right? So I think it's something that can be kind of scary. I think whenever I've talked about this project with people, so the funny thing is like when I talk about these projects with people and people are like, well, I'm never going to do that MIT challenge. And I'm kind of like, well, that's kind of fair. It was like, it was sort of purposefully an extreme project, but you maybe could take a class or two online. But the language learning one, like we left because I did this with my friend who he was just happened to be my roommate. This is not like some guy I picked because he's like, oh yeah, and I've got, polymath, Joe Schmo with me who's, IQ 100. This is the guy I just lived with. And I was like, you want to do this too? And he's like, yeah, sure. And I mean, he didn't even really study that hard. I don't want to like shit on him on this podcast, but I mean, we were in Spain and he's like, I'm not studying. I don't want to study. And I remember sitting him down after like about a month in, and I was like, dude, you got to learn to conjugate. things. Like, this is not like, we've been here for a month. Is not cool that you're just saying like,
What a line.
you know, well, he was saying, he was saying, what was he saying when we were there? Like he would just use like the infinitive version and just like, I'm just gonna say like yo sir, like I'm not gonna say the thing properly, and people understood him, but it was like, okay, no, this is like, it's okay to not speak, but you've been here for a month now, this isn't cool anymore. So I remember we had like over dinner, I'm like, I'm gonna teach you this and you're gonna start saying it properly. So like I don't want to say he was lazy, he definitely wasn't, but he was more interested in the travel experience. He was really interested in photography. If you watch our videos, he's doing these like time lapses and stuff. That was what he wanted to do. The Spanish thing was kind of inside. So the fact that he learned it, the fact that he did this and was successful with it, I think is also saying something about the technique and about it being somewhat more approachable. And so I've said this to people like who are like, I'm going to go live somewhere else for a period of time and I want to learn the language. So admittedly, this is not everyone who's learning a language. So this is not advice that I apply, to every single person, but it's like, I'm going to go live in, Buenos Aires for 9 months. And I'm like, great, you should do this. And universally, the response I get is like, nah, I don't think I'm going to do that. And I think it's hard for me to convey to those people that not only can you do it, but you'd be successful with it. And you'd thank yourself later for doing it, because 3 months in, when you're actually pretty good at Spanish and you can just sort of relax a little bit, you don't have to worry about like, oh, I'm only going to speak in Spanish. You have this ability that like helps you in your daily life for the rest of the year. And so I feel really badly for people who, like, I would meet people who had lived in like particularly Asian countries for like 2 decades, and they're like, their Chinese is limited to like ni hao ma. And it's like, I know Chinese is hard. I know this is difficult. So I'm not trying to like, make light of it or do this kind of thing. But if you're going to live there your whole life and you don't speak it, you're impoverishing yourself, because most people don't speak English. And so you're just forever kind of at the mercy of like the handful of, educated people who speak English or other expats. And I think it leads to an impoverished experience being in that country, because I can't count on my hand the number of experiences I had where it's like, well, I couldn't have done this if I was just in the English speaking bubble. But it's not apparent that those are there when you're doing this. So again, I don't want to be overly critical if you're struggling under this. This isn't me trying to like scold you. It's more just that I think more people could and would benefit from taking this approach to learning a language if they're going to stay in a place for long enough to make it worth it. I mean, 2 weeks is a little bit aggressive, but if you're going to be there for like 3 months, even, I would say that, if you're not like overly stressed with other things involved in traveling, I think it can be beneficial.
Yeah. Something that really surprised me that I didn't expect, that I've absolutely loved, is music. It's like exploring a whole, it's like as I explore more music and English as I was growing up, I felt like finding new music was like a treasure. You're finding a new song that you liked. Yeah. But then when you enter a whole new language, you get to explore this treasure trove of stuff that you've never even explored. It was a really amazing benefit that I didn't expect.
Oh, definitely. Like, I mean, that was one of the things. Like, we really emphasize this no English rule, but consuming media in other countries was something that we really enjoyed too. So like I still have like, albums that are saved on my phone that are, in Spanish or Portuguese or Mandarin or this kind of thing. And I think it's hard to learn from those resources. Like, even if you listen to English songs, like I'm a native English speaker, and you listen to like the English songs that are on the radio right now, and you're like, ask me to write down the lyrics, and I cannot. So if you appreciate that difficulty in your native language, you can only imagine how difficult it is with another language. Although like Spotify now has the lyrics. I haven't done that yet, but that was always the thing. Like, what is this person saying in Spanish? But you could actually just look it up and translate, and you're like, oh, okay. All right. It sounded
especially
nice,
with the slang, especially with the slang, and like,
yeah. Well, any kind of like, hip hop adjacent kind of field is going to be like, and that's the thing too. I mean, when you're doing this kind of approach, you tend to learn words and vocabulary that come up in your immediate experience. So I cannot say that my Spanish has perfect breadth. And I've been in situations where I will be talking to like Mexicans, for instance, and the Spanish is quite different from, and so like, like watching a Mexican movie is like, oh, it's impossible. I can't understand anything anyone's saying. And it's, the accent's different, the vocabulary is different. Again, slang is different, this kind of thing. And so, I do think one kind of side effect of this process is that you learn the language, but you learn it in a highly individualized way. So there's certain words and phrases through daily experience, but then there's other things that are like part of the canon of like, if you know Spanish, you should know this that you don't know, which is very different from taking a class where someone has tried to figure out a generic Spanish that covers the most possible cases and teach it to you. This is going to be a lot more idiosyncratic, and so it ends up being embarrassing when there's things that like you really feel like you should know and you don't, but it's also can be kind of nice that you are able to perform at a level with maybe a more limited vocabulary than you would be able to in other situations.
Yeah, I found what was really interesting, and I heard you talk about it on a different podcast, was about Duolingo and how much time I've spent on goddamn Duolingo. And then, like my mother-in-law, she's broken English. And so she speaks Spanish really fast, Colombian. Yeah. And then I'm like, I don't understand anything that you're saying. And I just spent like 50 hours of my life on this app, pressing buttons, reading back, doing the myriad of different activities that they get you to do, but retaining next to nothing, it seemed like.
Yeah, so Duolingo, first of all, I should say that because I wrote about Duolingo in the book, so I have this chapter on directness, and my critique of Duolingo at the time was very much like, this isn't what you're doing when you're speaking a language. Like, this was like, I remember I did it for Italian. I went on my honeymoon. I went to Italy for 3 weeks, and I thought I should do it, and I should try Duolingo. Duolingo wasn't really available when we were doing the year without English. It never factored in. Like, it wasn't even like we tried it and rejected it. I remember doing Duolingo Spanish after Spain, and they do this kind of like assessment test, and I think I was at the end of the test. It was like, oh, you already know it, so I was like, oh, okay. But I did it for Italian because I thought, well, I should try this out. And I was very disappointed with it. So I'm saying this from my limited experience with Duolingo. I also want to stress that they're always changing the app too. So I know these are critiques circa, 2016, 2015 when I was writing the book. It could also be that they've improved it since then, and I'm now slandering them on this podcast.
The fact that it changes so much is so confusing. Like for me, I'm like going back to the app and I'm like, everything's different. And now it's a new way of
Well, I've heard they've been integrating with ChatGPT to do this kind of like, you can actually converse with it. And I don't know whether that works. I haven't tried the feature myself, but I mean, if it does, then I might hold my critiques of them now. But here's my problem. Here was my problem with Duolingo. And I sympathize with the developers of Duolingo. So I'm not just trying to say, oh, they're just ignorant and I know everything about language learning. I'm sure they have people who know about language learning on their staff. I'm sure they have linguists who know more than I do, who are going to be tisk-tisking me right now. But here's the thing. Duolingo has two problems, I think, that make it not a great app for language learning. The first is that a lot of the exercises they get you to do are kind of language adjacent, but they're not really what you're doing when you're speaking. So for instance, it'll be, here's a sentence, put it in English, and then there's little, you drag around the words to get the word order. And maybe that practices the word order, and maybe it makes you a little bit more familiar with the words, which is not a totally negative thing. But that's not what you have to do when you're making a sentence. When you're making a sentence, you have to construct it. So you have some meaning that you want to express. In the beginning, you probably also automatically turn that meaning into the English sentence. So I don't want to say you're always translating when you're speaking another language, but at least in the beginning, you often are, because the English meaning turns into a sentence instantly in your thoughts. And you're trying to figure out how to express it. And so you have to recall what the words are. So you have to recall the translation of the words. You have to do whatever grammar is required to assemble them in the right way. And then you need to pronounce them. You actually have to use your lips and hair to make the sounds. And so if the only thing you're doing in this particular exercise is just organizing the words, you're only doing one of 8 of those things. And so if you need to do all 8 to be fluid and you only have 1 of them, and then you go there and you're speaking, it's it doesn't help you, right? It's like if you drive a car, but you only know how to, change gears. And changing gears is an important part of driving a car. I don't want to say you don't want to practice that either, but you're not going to be able to drive a car if you don't know about the gas pedal and the steering wheel and the blinkers and all the other things that are involved in driving a car. So my feeling is that Duolingo tends to underprepare people. Now, why does it do that? I think that it does that for two reasons. One is that at least in the version of Duolingo that I was testing, which again is quickly becoming dated. So if someone wants to reply in the comments that Duolingo doesn't work that way anymore, then I rescind all my criticisms. Um, the way it was working is that, well, let's say you're translating a sentence. Here's the problem. There's lots of different ways you could translate a sentence. And how do you have the thing tell you whether you got it right or not? It's hard because if I write it in a slightly different order and it just tells me, nope, that wasn't the way I was thinking, that's going to be overly punitive, right? On the other hand, if it doesn't catch that I made an important fundamental mistake, that's also not good because then I'm going to be learning it wrong. So I think the way that they solved that is they restricted your degrees of freedom in putting input in the app so that either you get it completely right or completely wrong. Like there's no like, well, that was another way of saying that kind of thing, right? So
it does do
I
that
think that's
to an extent now.
Yeah.
It does do that, but definitely to
it's
an
better.
extent.
Well, okay, if it's better, then again, as I said, I have to revisit every once in a while because I think the app changes so much. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think is that they're trying to retain users. So they understand that the people who are learning languages have, I would say, like they mostly want it to be a game and only slightly want it to teach them a language. Like most people who are learning a language are like, I want something fun to do on my phone. They're not like, I actually have to seriously prepare for this language that's coming up. And so this is my critique of maybe the Duolingo audience rather than the Duolingo creators. But they understand that if they make the app too hard, or if they ask people to do things that are more mentally effortful or require you to like do things like, you know, okay, I actually have to take 10 minutes out of my day to do this rather than just like, you know, I'm sitting on the bus or on the toilet or something playing around for 2 minutes. They're not going to do it. I'm going to lower user retention. And so I think that those two constraints make it hard to have a good language learning app. And so I think that Duolingo is probably not useless. I think I was a little too harsh with it with the book. I think it's probably not useless, probably helps with some things. But I think it only works if you go in with the assumption that this is definitely not going to teach me everything I need to be fluent. And when I start going in speaking situations, it's going to feel like I learned nothing. You probably did learn some things, but you're like, again, if you imagine the skill set being 10 components, if you've learned 3 and you need to do the other 7, it doesn't feel like you've learned 3. It feels like you've learned 0. So that would be my critique. The other critique I would say is that a lot of people who use Duolingo, because it's gamified, because it's easy to use, because it's fun, it's very easy to use it for like a year or two. And then after a year or two of any study of a language, with even I think you're spending like, 2-3 hours a week, you should be able to have a simple conversation. I'm sorry. If whatever you're using does not let you have a simple conversation, it's not a good technique. And so I recently went to there's a Chinese language meetup here, and I hadn't gone in a couple of years, and I went there, and I was talking to a guy who's very earnestly trying to learn Mandarin. And Mandarin's very hard, don't get me wrong. There's lots of people who study it for a long time and have difficulty speaking it. But this guy was like not able to understand or put together, like, I would say like the unit 1 kind of sentences. Like I asked him, like, why are you learning Mandarin? Which is like, and I said it very slowly, and he could hear the words, but it was like his brain couldn't assemble the syntax to figure out what the meaning of that sentence was. And again, I'm not trying to be critical. This guy was really earnestly trying to learn it, but he wasn't able to do that. And I asked him like, oh, how long have you been learning? He said, 2 years with Duolingo. Well, here's the thing. If you spent 2 years and you're not able to do that one-on-one task, that's very demotivating in terms of actual use. It gives you the impression that language learning, well, I must just have to spend 80 years learning this, rather than, well, maybe if you used a different approach to learning, you'd be getting better results. So what I typically recommend instead is Pimsleur. I really like Pimsleur for the very early stages of learning a language. Of course, I think actual use conversations are good. Tutoring is good. Textbooks are good. So these are things that are later on. But if we're talking about like, I don't know anything, what should I use? I usually recommend doing a month of Pimsleur, because what Pimsleur gets you to do is it forces you to retrieve whole phrases. It actually gets you to like, later on, it gets you to like sub in phrases. So you learn kind of the sentence structure a little bit, like a little bit of conjugation. And most importantly, the structure is this kind of pattern of like, now say, like I still remember the ones from Spanish. It's like, now say, where is the Bolivar restaurant? And it's like, ¿Dónde está el restaurante Bolivar? And like, you can remember these phrases. Like this was 10 years ago, and I still remember that stupid Bolivar restaurant phrase because it generally gets in your memory so deep that you can't forget it. And now, how useful is knowing where the Restaurante Bolivar is? Probably not that useful, but it does get you to learn that sentence phrase pattern of donde está whatever. And so if donde está whatever is in your kind of deeply learned procedural memory, then when you go somewhere and you have to ask like, donde está el estación del metro, you can say that because all you need is to slot in the vocabulary. And so Pimsleur, I think, is more useful for prep. It does require half an hour of focused time. You can do it commute and this kind of thing, but it's harder than Duolingo. So my impression is that people enjoy Pimsleur less than Duolingo, but it's 1 month, and after you can actually say some things, which I can't usually say about Duolingo. So that's my critique of Duolingo. If you're just wanting a game to play and you want it to be language themed, then go right ahead. I don't want to be like too much poo-pooing people's parade. But if you were thinking, okay, well, I do actually really want to learn X, I would recommend doing Pimsleur first. And then I usually also recommend doing flashcards over Duolingo, because at least flashcards, again, it is also just a slice of the language ability, but memorizing what words are is a super, super useful skill to have. Like if you just have like 1,000, 2,000 words just memorized, it assists so much. It's not everything, but it assists so much in learning a new language, because you can just like, oh, that's what that word is, and you can just say it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, would you mind talking about expanding a bit on the importance of like winning, and having quick wins in the journey of commitment? Because it is a big commitment.
Yeah.
And it's hard. Like I found it one of the most hardest things I've done.
The language learning. Yeah. Well, I think our entire motivation, like what motivates us, what gets you to do ambitious things is this kind of selective reinforcement cycle. And I think motivation is actually really simple. It's hard because sometimes the situation is not amenable to our motivation, but like people make a big deal about a lot of, I'm going to psych myself up. But basically motivation is basically you've been reinforced for doing certain things, and it makes you more likely to do them in the future. So I think the behaviorists were right about this, that motivation can be explained simply by reinforcement. And so when you're approaching, let's say, a subject you're studying, and you have frustration, those are like punishments. Those are like the rat in the cage getting zapped. And then eventually they stop pressing the lever. And so I think for a lot of people, they give up on learning because you have frustration, and then you stop doing it. Whereas if you have small success, you get more motivated. It becomes more fun to do the thing that you're doing. And so a big part of architecting a successful learning project is trying to design it in a way that, not that you're avoiding difficulty. Don't get me wrong. I think if you're just having fake wins where you're not actually doing the thing that you're doing, it's not helpful either. But kind of navigating it of like, how can I steer this ship so that I'm getting wins early on so that I'm building my motivation. So this is one reason I actually like starting with conversations with language learning. I know there's a big academic debate over how important conversations are. I know there's a lot of researchers who are very input focused, and there's a whole community of language learners that really like reading and listening. And I think that can work too, so I don't want to be totally dismissive of that approach. But one nice thing about conversations is that the other person you're talking to knows that you're not very good. And they automatically adjust their level of language. So if you need language at level 1 in order to communicate, the other person will try to bring it down. Now, some people aren't very successful at that, and they can only bring it down to 4, and then you still fail to talk to them. But I've had conversations with people where I don't speak their language at all. So people are good at adjusting. They're like, you're grunting and pointing, like people can get to that. And that's an important part of learning any new skill, is that the tasks are at your difficulty level. And so language learning conversations tend to do this, whereas books or movies do not. So if you're watching a movie and it's a level 8 and you're level 6, well, you can only understand it with subtitles, right? You don't understand what's going on. And there's ways you can work around it. You can watch it a couple times. You can watch it with subtitles and then without. But that also tends to be kind of annoying and this kind of thing. Normally, we don't watch the same movie like 3 times in a row. So there are ways around it. And if you're going to do reading or listening, it's really important to have like graded materials. So, and often that means you have to do graded materials for a while, because native level media tends to be quite hard. Like it is something that you acquire, I would say, later than conversational ability if you're doing it that way. And so that's what I would recommend, is that if you do a conversational approach, it's a little bit easier. So going to like italki, italki.com, that's the one that I usually use, and you can book tutors. They used to have conversation partners. I think they maybe discontinued that feature, but there's other apps that can set you up with partners. So if you don't want to pay for a tutor, you just like 50-50 English and whatever language they want to learn. And you can do the little mini no English for like that half hour. And it is strenuous. I don't want to say that but there's something really rewarding about like being able to even just, say simple things like, I like to eat pasta. Like, I mean, it doesn't have to be, deep philosophical conversations. And so I think that gives you that reward. I think there's something really satisfying about being in another country, interacting with someone where you can't speak English or they don't speak English, and like successfully accomplishing a communicative goal. I mean, you just don't get that when you spend years, in a textbook or doing flashcards. I think the intrinsic interest has to be really high to succeed with that approach. Whereas, as I said, when I was in Tokyo and I was like trying to figure out whether we could order breakfast, even though we didn't order it online in Japanese, it was difficult. But when I found out that no, we could not, I was satisfied that communication interaction had been achieved. Whereas before, if I hadn't done anything before I got there, it would have been like, well, okay, whatever. So I think getting those kind of rewards is very important. So I don't want to say shy away from difficulty, but I want to say, navigating the difficulty is important because you want to pick things where it's sort of like, okay, I can be successful at this. I can be successful at this. And that builds your motivation and your confidence.
Yeah. And it sounds like you're also talking about free recall. Is that right? I've heard you talk about that. And the importance of struggling is actually like how our could you expand on how the perception of how we're learning things, and like sometimes the people that do rote, they think they've learned something better versus the people that have, done free recall. They actually think they've done worse, but they're actually have a better result.
So I think the research you're referring to was comparing review and recall. So the retrieval practice, or what psychologists also call the testing effect, is a well-documented memory phenomenon. And this is basically the idea that if you give someone to test for knowledge, so you're not giving them more information, you just ask them to recall what they've already seen, their memory gets strengthened more than if you show it to them again. And there are some exceptions to this, so we could get into that as well. There's some complexities in the literature. But for something like language learning, where you're learning vocabulary, I think it's pretty safe to say that this is true. Where, if I were to teach you the word for car is el coche, and I was just to say it's el coche, like 10 times to you, versus I said once it's el coche, and then I said, okay, what is car again? And you say el coche, you're going to remember it better in the second condition. And so this is one benefit of having conversations, is because the speed of conversations, you generally have to do this, you're going to be practicing more recall, because not only... So another like little confusion. When you're reading in another language, you're also doing recall because you're trying to recall what the English word is from what you're seeing. And when you're speaking, you're doing the opposite. So I don't want to make this about reading versus speaking, because they're both involving retrieval practice. But when you're speaking, because it's happening quickly, it's hard to just like Google Translate everything and just read it, right? So I don't want to say you do have to read it the first time. Like you have to get it from somewhere. But if you're going to continue to practice, you do it this way. So there was this really interesting study that I talk about in the book, where I have a chapter on retrieval practice, where the authors of the study split people into different groups. And one group, they got to do repeated reviews. So you have some text that you're reading, and you use your available time. You read it multiple times. The other people, they read it once, closed it, and they did what's called free recall. So free recall is a subset of retrieval practice, where it's basically like blank paper, write down everything you remember, as opposed to like cued recall, where it's like, what is car in Spanish? And it's like, oh, do you remember what I said before? So this free recall activity, they just sort of blank page, and there's no feedback. There's no like, oh, you forgot this or you remembered this. It's literally just retrieval. And this is an important, like, feedback's valuable for learning, but this is important for just the kind of scientific or the theoretical value of this technique, is that you do this free recall, and you ask people after they've done both of these, how well do you think you'll do on a test? And the repeated review people are very confident. They're like, I know this because I've read it like 8 times. The retrieval practice people, in contrast, rate themselves very poorly. They're like, man, I could barely remember anything. I'm not going to do well on the test. But when you actually test them, it's the opposite. The people who did free recall more. And this, the theory of this, proposed by psychologist Robert Bjork, is that when you read something over and over again, it gets increasingly fluent. And so we don't actually have access to like memory stores where we can see like, oh, this is like, a battery signal. Like this memory's at 50% strength. We don't know that. All we have is how easy it feels for us when we're thinking about it. And if you read something over and over again, it becomes fluent really quickly. because it's very easy to read things. Whereas if you're struggling to recall something, it doesn't become fluent, but the effort itself helps form these stronger memories. So I don't want to make too broad a statement about like, well, just the more difficult something is, the better it is for learning. Because as we talked about, matching the difficulty level is important. If you're just watching a movie where you don't understand anything, you're not actually going to learn very much Spanish. It'll be hard and it will not be very helpful for you. But having a conversation where you actually have to recall what you're trying to say and you have to actually use the little mental mechanisms to like produce the grammar rather than just reading it or just looking at it is very helpful. And so particularly if you're a memory intensive subject like language learning, retrieval practice is essential. And again, that's also one of my critiques of Duolingo is that when you're doing drag and drop, you don't have to retrieve any of the words, right? Whereas if you have flashcards where it's like, on one it's like car and then I have to say el coche on the back, I actually had to do retrieval practice. And so that is more effective than like drag el coche to car on the app. They're subtly different, but the second one is not going to be as effective. Because all you have to do is recognize that those two match rather than produce el coche and like, all the sounds and everything in your head and assemble that together.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really curious, like, as you stated before, less responsibilities, you're able to commit to, just going off to, do a year trip and stuff like that.
Yeah.
How do you structure your learning time now when you have more responsibilities, family, business, all that sort of stuff?
It's harder. I got to be honest. Like, I'll be candid about that because, I'm talking to you right now and like we're having this podcast. You're in a different time zone. And so we started at like 8:30 a.m. And so I'm waking up early. But like I also, in the middle of the night, my daughter, she's 7 months old. She was up between 2 and 3. And there are very frequent days where it's like you wake up at 6 and it's like 9 p.m. is like the first moment you have to do something that's like not like immediately dealing with the situation. So if you're like 9 and then you got to go to bed at 10 because you're going to wake up twice in the night, that's definitely not 10 hours a day. But I do think you can still learn things. And so I don't want to create the kind of like, well, anyone could do the MIT challenge. Like one question that always drove me bananas is that I get emails from people be like, do you think I could do the MIT challenge if I'm also working a full-time job? And I'm kind of like, well, I don't know. I couldn't. I don't know if you could. That's great. But like, it was really hard for me. Like, I don't know what you want me to say, right? But that doesn't mean you can't learn anything. And so, like, as I said, when you asked me at the very beginning of the show what I'm learning right now, so I'm doing some watercolor painting. So what I do is I have like my area set up so that it like, okay, it's 9 p.m. I've maybe like sat on my phone just to like decompress for like 10 minutes. And then it's like, okay, I'll go there and I'll work on it for a little bit. And then, oh, the baby's up. Okay, I just stop. I put it there. So having the sort of space open for doing something like that, it's not, I'm not going to lie. It's not the same as being able to do it for 10 hours a day. Like if you're a fine art student and you're like 12 hours a day doing artistic projects, your skills will mature faster. That's just obvious. But the same thing with language learning, if you only have 20 minutes, maybe you can't even like schedule practices for conversations. Like there's probably, like, as I said, Duolingo's half an hour. You don't have to do it all in one burst. You could do 5 minutes. Whenever you get interrupted, just pause it and start again. Like it is possible to do it. So I don't want to be too hard on people who are in like the extreme exhaustion, time deprivation state. Cause I know when you're in that state, someone telling you, well, you really should be learning languages and really should be doing this is not what you want to hear. But I do think the problem is more motivational than time. It's more, this task isn't pleasant enough for me, or I don't get enough rewards from it. Like going back to this motivational thing, like I don't find it enjoyable enough to keep doing it. And so often what you need to do when you're in a situation like mine, where you have a lot less time, but you still abstractly want to learn things, but often concretely you find it difficult, is you need to figure out, how do I restructure the task so that it's more motivating? So like, as I said, a big thing for me, what was holding me back from, working on this art, is I didn't have a dedicated space for it, and I couldn't just set it up and go. So every time I wanted to start, I had to pull everything out and what am I doing, and like get everything ready, and like, I'll get this ready and this ready and this ready. And so if you have to do 10 minutes of setup and you only have 15 minutes, you're not going to do it very often, right? And so I think that's true of a lot of things, is that like reduce the friction, make it at your difficulty level, make it more enjoyable. I do think you want to care about the efficacy, but if you were just like, I don't know if I want to learn Chinese, then Duolingo is probably not bad, but I wouldn't want to be like the guy who was like, actually, I really want to learn Chinese. I've been doing it for 2 years and I don't know what Wei Shima means. Like, it's like, oh, okay. Maybe you want to shift up at that point. But I do think that understanding the motivational context is really important because the same people who say, oh, I have no time to learn, somehow watch a lot of Netflix or, they're active on Instagram. And this isn't to tisk them. It's just to state a fact that when something is easy and it's like available and we don't have to do any setup costs, we end up doing a lot more of it. So if you can take that mindset or those ideas and apply it to your learning, you do end up actually reading more books when you have it on your phone all the time than, when you have your Instagram app right there.
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it? That's been one of the most powerful things that I've done is just setting up my environment properly and just be like, phone doesn't belong in the bedroom, Kindle is in the bedroom.
Yeah.
It's the exact same motion. Is like, and it's just you've replaced one with reading a book versus, who knows what when you're in bed on your phone. So I'm really curious. Would you mind expanding, or sounds like you touched a little bit on the idea of mental models and preparing before we're learning, the importance of prepping for our learning journey versus careering straight in.
Well, so again, this part of the context of this as well is this Ultralearning. So in the book, which is titled Ultralearning, I'm talking about these kind of intensive learning efforts. So just to switch gears from when we were talking about the how do you spend 5 minutes a day doing Pimsleur? If we're talking about I want to learn something that I know is going to be hard, I am committed for it. So background context. Part of the difficulty with learning is that there's a real catch-22 that the knowledge you need to guide your learning process, you also don't have when you start. So it's not just that learning Chinese is difficult because there's a lot of Chinese knowledge that I don't have. It's also that I don't have much knowledge about how is Chinese structured? Like, what's the best way to learn it? I don't have that. And that means that if you're a self-directed learner, so if you're doing what I'm advocating, which is taking on your own projects, you're really at the mercy of the materials you find, right? So if you, for instance, I'm making this kind of esoteric point about Duolingo, but the average person is totally oblivious to this, right? It's a very subtle distinction about whether you're doing retrieval flashcard for a word or whether you're drag and dropping. This is not something that you're going to notice when you're doing it, that this is why it doesn't work as well because I'm not doing this key element of this activity. It's totally opaque to you. And that's the same with most classes. If you take a class that it just turns out it's badly taught, they're not telling you what you need to know, you're not going to know. You're just going to be like, I must not be very good at this, right? And so this can lead to a lot of frustrations and difficulties, and especially for skills where there's lots of materials, there's lots of different things you can use. You can be overwhelmed. Like language learning is one of those things where, as I said, I've done it enough times that I prefer Pimsleur to Duolingo, and I think these reasons are good. And everyone's going to have different opinions and different strategies as well. But that you don't come into it from the first time with that knowledge. And so, especially for a subject you can only learn once, this can create a lot of frustration because it's like, oh man, if I'd only known this, I would have done it differently from the beginning. So meta learning is what I talk about in my book, of this process of kind of preparing your map of what does this skill actually look like? How do people learn it? How is it organized? What are going to be the bottlenecks? What is going to be the difficulty? What is going to be the thing I have to focus on in order to get good at this? And there's different levels of abstraction there. So learning a language, for instance, we can talk about it at a very basic level. We know that there's going to be vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar. So vocabulary is going to be things you have to memorize. Grammar is going to be a kind of procedural skill. It's going to be kind of how do you assemble the little parts into a sentence the correct way. And, depending on the language, that could be fairly simple, like Chinese, where you're just kind of ordering words, or it could be like Russian, where you have also all these cases and inflections and stuff. And then there's going to be pronunciation, which, again, for some languages is going to be relatively trivial. If you're an English speaker, Japanese and Spanish, not going to be too hard, probably. Mandarin with its tones is going to be very hard. And then there's indigenous languages in the Amazon that are near impossible. They've got so many phonemes. So if you have this kind of abstract, okay, very high level, these are what I'm going to have to build in. But then you break it down further. So if I know I'm learning Mandarin, for instance, I can look up, okay, well, I know it has characters. How many characters does the average person need to know to read or to be able to function? So if I'm also trying to be literate, I know that, you probably need between 2,000 and 3,500 to be able to read things. Okay, I know that most words are actually not one character, but more than one character. They're usually like in modern Mandarin, I would say the majority of words are disyllabic, so you have two characters next to each other. That's how words are formed. And then I'm going to dig deeper. I'm going to figure out, how do characters work? And I look it up and I'd be like, okay, well, some of the characters are pictures. A lot of them are more like rhymes. Like it's like, this sounds like another thing that it's, that has a picture. And there's different kinds of, that they're organized by radicals. So that's how you look them up in the dictionary. Maybe you like go in even deeper and you can be like, oh, okay, well, there's a method for learning the characters where you're figuring out like kind of how they came about, like their etymology and this kind of thing. So this is sort of like, I'm not saying you would necessarily come to all those conclusions if you just Google like how to learn Mandarin or how to learn characters or how do Chinese characters work. But let's say if you knew you were going to spend at least 100 hours learning it and you spent the first 10 hours just like, what are all the ways of learning Mandarin? What are all the resources? How does the language structured? How does it work? What do people find difficult? Blah, blah, blah. You're going to be much, much more well equipped to make those decisions about how to learn and how to like guide your learning and how to have proper expectations than if it were just like, Duolingo, I'm going to download that and start practicing. Now, again, going back to the context of this, part of the context is you have some serious goal. You're ready to start. You're going to embark on a big, intensive project. If you're not ready for that yet, if you're like, I don't even know whether I want to learn Mandarin, then just learning a little bit and dabbling is not so bad, because when you learn a subject, you also necessarily acquire some meta-linguist or sort of meta-learning knowledge about it. So if I start learning math, I start to also figure out, okay, what is this learning math thing like, right? So you can also do it a dabbling approach, but I highly recommend the investing in the meta-learning as a precursor to doing, if you're doing any kind of like, well, I'm spending the next 3 months full-time doing this, I highly recommend, spending that 10, 20 hours doing this, just because if you can identify, oh, this resource works better than this for this good reason, you might save yourself 10 hours and that took 10 minutes. So there's a balance there. And I've made that mistake. Like, I did a project after the year without English where I was doing portrait drawing. And my naive theory of how you get good at artistic skills was that, well, I just need to draw a lot and get good feedback. And so what I was doing, my sort of technique that I was using, so I would draw a portrait and then I would take a picture of my drawing and I would overlay it transparently with Photoshop over the original image to be like, oh, I made the eyes too big or I made the head too small. And that's not a terrible technique. But the thing that I didn't realize at the time was that there are actually really good techniques for sizing things, for doing things, that is not just something you just acquire from feedback. Like it's a method you have to learn, just like long division is a method. And, if you were just given random division problems and you just guessed and got feedback, you wouldn't naturally invent long division. So that's an example where my meta learning research failed, because I did a cursory survey of like, what are techniques for portrait drawing? And I didn't find this one. And so I started doing the other thing. And then about halfway through, I was like, nah, I'm kind of hitting diminishing returns. I got to go do another meta-learning research. And then I found about this technique and it helped a lot. So there's kind of an interplay between doing the practice and like getting the feedback. And one of the best ways you can get that feedback is by talking to people who've already learned it. Sometimes this can be a little bit iffy because, well, I've been doing it for 20 years and so I totally forget how I've learned it is a problem. But definitely if you can find someone who's learned it recently, that helps. And also finding people who teach it, because if you teach it, you're regularly in contact with people who have not learned it. So talking to a teacher, even if you're not going to like attend the fancy art school, talking to someone who teaches art and be like, how would you learn to draw? They're going to have some ideas about that because they're interacting with students all the time. Or, maybe I can't afford the expensive all immersion Mandarin class, but I can talk to a Mandarin teacher and be like, what do I need to do to like, what resources do you recommend? And that would help too. So doing this kind of cursory research is, I think, very helpful to overcome at least partly that paradox of how do you learn something when you don't already know it,
Yeah, absolutely. And to wrap up, I'd love to get some words of advice from you. And that was incredibly helpful because I've gone down that path myself. And you're just like, it's the typical kind of like what we talked about, the Duolingo trap. Yeah. It's like, you're like, this, everyone's doing it. And then you're like, oh my God. Yeah. Words of advice to help someone who's chosen a project and helping them to stay committed to that project so they can have wins and keep it. Yeah. Finish it, see it through.
So my advice is actually maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but I think the best way to commit to hard projects is to make them shorter and easier to commit to. I think the mistake most people make is that I mean, it sounds ironic for the guy who's doing these big year-long projects, but the mistake most people make is they commit to too much. And when you commit to too much and then halfway through you find it hard and unpleasant, you're more likely to give up. But if you commit to something that's smaller, you're more likely to see it through to the end. So what I would recommend is, like, for instance, if I were doing like the no English thing, I would say, try it for 2 weeks. Don't say, oh, I'm going to do it for 3 months. Try it for the first 2 weeks and see how it goes, right? And you can always recommit if it's working. You can always do more, but committing for smaller chunks is a little bit easier. And so that is a skill in and of itself of, like, how do I break down this huge goal that is the thing I actually want into smaller, like, milestones that I could commit to. So I think that's one key. I think the other key is to make sure you're structuring the rewards properly in the activity, because when you fail to stick to something, usually there's a motivational deficit, and usually it's because the balance of frustrations to joys to, like, wins to happiness in the project is off center. And again, you can push through a hard project over a short period of time, but those little micro rewards I think are important. And so how you can drip that out, like we already talked about, like scaling the difficulty, so you're working on things where you're, like, actually feeling like you're winning quite a bit of the time, even if it's like simple stuff, is very important. I think finding something that makes the activity meaningful too can also be important. Like, as I said, it's one thing to be like, oh, I got 80% of my flashcards right, who cares, to like, oh, I was able to, like, talk to that guy even, like, badly for 2 minutes and get what I wanted, is like, yeah, so that makes a big difference. And I think, again, I think I tend to also do the other way, where, like, I don't commit to projects lightly either. So dabbling's fine, but when I'm taking on a big project, or I'm going to do this for a month, it's because I've been thinking about doing that project for a while. So I'm never like, what should I do? And then just pull it out of my hat. Oh, I guess I'm going to learn jujitsu for a month. No, it's because, like, I'd been obsessing about that I'm not learning jujitsu, but I've been obsessing about whatever it was for a long period of time before I, like, okay, let's make the commitment. And I think that's my natural inclination. I think most people I talk to who are, like, maybe going to sit through an hour and a half thing where a guy's talking about learning is the kind of person who, like, they have too many things they want to learn. Not like, oh, I'm not interested in anything. Like, you're someone who, like, you want to learn this sport, you want to learn this language, you want to learn this subject, you want to be better at this, and blah, blah, blah. If you're that kind of person, if you're like me, that kind of person, then you already have lots of things that you want to do that are percolating, right? That are, like, in the simmer. So that's a good thing to have. And it's good to be like, I've been thinking about learning Spanish, like, because my girlfriend speaks it. I've been wanting to do this project for years now. Right? So when you go in and you're like, okay, for the next 2 months, we're only going to speak in Spanish with each other, and it's hard. I know I've been thinking about it for like 2 years that I want to do this, and I'm excited about it. So it's easier to commit to. Whereas if it's just sort of like, let's just learn this random thing that I have no, like, it's never like, and I'm going to do this for 2 months, and I just flippantly make that commitment. Yeah, of course you're going to give it up after like 3 weeks. And one final advice for committing is plan your obstacles in advance, because I think that's another thing that people struggle with, is they don't see all the ways that things are going to be difficult. And you can't see all the ways, but if you do some thinking of, like, well, what's a reasonable thing that's going to make this hard? So, oh, I'm speaking to my girlfriend only in Spanish, but we have an important relationship fight and I can't do it in Spanish. So, like, okay, maybe let's have, like, a timeout rule, right? Where we can have a timeout if there's an important conversation that needs to happen. Okay, that's a mild exception. That's not so bad. Or, this is really hard because we're in a group conversation setting, and the other people I'm talking to are only speaking in English, and, like, what am I only going to speak to her in Spanish? That's weird, right? Okay, well, we'll make an exception for this. Like, just doing that in advance helps, because you know how you're going to handle that obstacle. And so once you're out of that group conversation, once the fight is simmered down, you guys have made up, then, okay, you can go back to it, because that was part of your plan initially, right? And so I think part of the committing to things is making this, foreseeing this, seeing that this is going to happen. When I was doing the MIT challenge, I was like, okay, I know I'm going to want to take this, week off at Christmas time. I know that I'm going to need I know that I'm going to be less productive over the year, so I need to get the early classes done faster. Like, these are simple things that are obvious if you think about them, but if you just commit to it without planning that, then of course your plan's going to fail. So I think if you're doing any intensive big project, whether it's learning or not, just like the meta learning research, doing this kind of like, what are all the ways this is going to go wrong? Like, a year from now, why did this fail? You figure out what those reasons are, and then you write what your response is going to be. Even if the response is just like, okay, we just put it on pause for a week because of that reason, helps so much more than like, well, I failed because I got sick. Well, why didn't you just say stop when I'm sick for a week, Like, that's a good way of keeping up that commitment.
Man, what a great place to finish. That was incredible.